sensitive biomarkers for these disorders is one of our real Achilles heels in this space because we need things that we can measure very accurately and reliably that are also not burdensome for the person living with the disorder. And this is a complication when it comes to, in the United States, for example, the accelerated approval process with the regulatory infrastructure that we look at things like dystrophin expression on muscle biopsy as a way to look for whether a treatment is effective. But that can't be translated into the clinic where insurance companies would say, we want a muscle biopsy showing this amount of change of dystrophin is just not a practical thing to expect of our patients being treated with these medications. And so we need to use functional measures because that's the hallmark of how these disorders affect people's lives, is that they lose their function over time in the neurodegenerative process. And as other systems become involved, we can sometimes use those also to be measured, like cardiomyopathy or pulmonary function testing or whatever it may be that we're trying to measure. When it comes to the functional assessments, many of us are so fortunate to have collaborators on our clinic teams that are really expert at this in the physical therapy world, occupational therapy, speech therapy, our orthopedic colleagues, our physical medicine and rehabilitation colleagues. All of these people work very hard to develop scales that are relevant for the disease, that are sensitive to change over time at various phases. And you can imagine how much of a challenge this is in a lifelong experience of a disorder that starts with a person who's relatively normal appearing and ends up with a person who can barely move in the context of Duchenne, for example. We need scales that are relevant across the phases of the disease. But then when it comes to therapies that have ongoing need for being administered, things like exon skipping with weekly IV infusions or an oral medication that someone's taking every day or whatever it may be, oftentimes we need as clinicians to follow something to ensure that we really believe that the person is benefiting from what we're doing, and also look for potential safety issues and tolerability problems in that person.
Well, the embark in the first studies of Sarepta have been based mostly on the North Star assessment, which is a scale with 17 items on which patients may score 0 if the patient is not able to perform the task, or 2 if the patient perfectly performs the task, and then 1 if he performs the task with some compensation. And the what we call the MCID, which is actually the smallest difference that is clinically significant, has been estimated around 2.5 to 3 points. And but if we look at the North Star another way, we can see that we can also try to figure out who are the patients who lose the ability to do something, which means that if a patient needs some compensation to do something, it's not a big deal from a patient perspective. The big deal is when you lose the ability, completely the ability to do something. So using this new way to look at North Star data, it's proposed that for patients, any ability that is lost is clinically significant. Of course, this is the lowest evidence of the definition of MCID, but this is quite an interesting view to try to reduce the scale to the possibility or not to do something. The North Star comes with some limitation, and one of the limitations is obviously the reliability in the younger patients. The 5 years old are not as reliable, and the 7 years old, as you might imagine, the 4 years old are even less reliable.
Stride velocity is being approved as an outcome measure in the European countries to be used in the clinical trials as a valid outcome and endpoint for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So that has been actually used in some of the clinical trials here in the Duchenne muscular dystrophy in the US, but we do not have long-term or accurate data from those studies yet to see if it is actually feasible and it is also useful in this setting.